Hi, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thank you for joining me for this IPA talk. I'm excited to have a couple of outstanding school leaders here with me. On my screen, I've got Andy Stump, who's principal at Winchester Elementary, and the 2021, make sure I got the year right, Andy, 2021 Middle School Principal of the Year for the state of Illinois, and then Dr. Marcus Beelan, who's current president of the Illinois Principals Association, also was named Digital Principal of the Year for NASSP not all that long ago. And both of these gentlemen had the opportunity to take part in a nice event that NASSP held, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, held last week. Today's date is May 3rd, held it last week. If I just remind me, fellas, the title National Principals Institute, correct? I got that right? How they title that up. Yeah, so you guys got to convene with other state principals of the year from throughout the United States and had some pretty unique experience. Marcus, you in particular had one that's probably left several people envious, I would say, just because it was so unique. But we'll definitely get into that. So anyway, Andy, let's just start with you. Let's talk a little bit about what happened and what was going on during your time out in DC.
Yeah, so as Jason and Marcus both know, sometimes I can be long-winded, so I'll try to keep it to a minimum. But yeah, we flew
You're
out.
a Cardinals fan, Andy, so you just talk as long as you.
Let's not do that.
So yeah, we flew out Sunday, arrived in Washington D.C., and NASSP welcomed us with open arms with a big welcome ceremony that evening, and we literally ran from 7:30 a.m. until 10:30 p.m. the entire time we were there, which don't get me wrong, was fantastic. I wouldn't trade the experiences that we had for anything, but we had the opportunity to, one of my favorite parts was to build networks from school districts across the country, school districts the size of Marcus's, to districts that were smaller than Winchester even, and to listen to their ideas and concerns, to celebrate the great things that are happening, to help each other try to find some maybe fixes for some issues going on, to know that we weren't alone, that some of the same issues that we have in rural central Illinois, Marcus has in northern Illinois and more populated parts that people in Nebraska or New York or Florida are having as well. So that was one of my favorite parts. We went to the Department of Education, which we may expand on a little bit. Thanks to Marcus, I sort of piggybacked off of his selfie with Secretary Cordona and the National Association, NASSP National Principal of the Year, Beth Huff. I still can't believe that happens, but that's why Marcus is the digital Principal of the Year across the nation, because he's got that phone ready to go.
At a moment's notice, man.
Yeah, he was ready, and I almost missed it because I wasn't paying attention. And then just I think one of the highlights, and I'm not just saying this because we're here, but I've seen Marcus from afar. I've met him at the IPA conference, but I never really had a chance to sit down and to truly interact with Marcus, and just to have that opportunity over that time. It's unfortunate that I had to go to DC to have that happen, but I told him I'm going to come up one of these days. I don't care what it takes. It may not be this school year, but he said I have an open-ended invitation, and I just wanted to go up there and just get to know him better, to see, watch him in his prime and in his element, and learn from him. And I feel like those 4 or 5 days that we were in DC, it gave me an opportunity to see more of what I already knew, and just help build me, better me as a person and as a leader in my building. So.
Hey, Huntley High School is an impressive place. I've had an opportunity to get a tour of that building and all that stuff. So it'll definitely be well worth the trip. So Marcus, I want to get to you in just a minute because of especially of a unique opportunity that you had as I kind of teed up at the top. But Andy, could you just talk a little bit about the sessions that you were having there as a part of the institutes? What were the things that NASSP had you do during your time together with these other leaders?
Yeah, so one of my favorite things they did is they didn't let us get comfortable with one table. They constantly required us to move around, to interact with other people. They had, maybe interactive questions that got us to not only talk about ourselves as people, but as school administrators. One of my favorite parts is they had breakout sessions at one time, and Marcus led one of those to talk about how to use social media to build up your school district, to tell our story, as Marcus sort of touched on early on. I got to think about the other two sessions, and I can come back to those. But we had 3 breakout sessions where we divided into 3 small groups, and we were able to rotate. And by doing that, we had smaller groups and allowed more interaction with people that I didn't really get to know prior to that point. So they did a fantastic job on those in those areas. They had a retired principal. I mean, he was in his 80s, been retired for 20 plus years from Ohio. In fact, I got his book right here that I'm started, Jim Mahoney. He was really, he was funny, he was entertaining, but yet his message was top notch. So, and really enjoyed that. And Marcus, you might have to help me with the name, the principal from Arizona that went through that horrible situation, where parents basically refused to leave and then they had to be arrested, and she was harassed and threatened, and it just, our hearts went out to her. But to hear, sometimes I think, oh man, what a terrible day. But then I heard her speak, and she got to tell her story, and we had a chance to interact. I was like, okay, maybe my bad days aren't as bad as I thought they were. So, I know I'm bouncing all over the place, but those are just some highlights from what the NASSP had to offer.
Yeah. Chris, during your time with those leaders, what were you hearing from them from across the country? I mean, Andy alluded to a few things, but what were you hearing during your interactions?
Yeah, so I think what's most important is that to know is that group of, I've been to a lot of conferences and have sat through a lot of PD, just being an educator. And this by far was, I could walk away and feel good about myself, even in the most challenging times as a school leader, and be able to connect with those who are going through similar things, but are also finding the light that exists in the tunnel. We're not going to say the end of the tunnel, because I don't know where everybody is, but it's a hole somewhere in the tunnel that people have been able to find their ability to connect to the real work that needs to happen, and to be able to tell the stories of what's happening in their school. And so, some of the stories that people were sharing, there was a principal from the East Coast that was there. He showed up on Sunday for the welcome reception. We were just sitting and talking, and he was just as calm. And I'm like, man, what's your school like? Like, what's going on? He was like, well, we had 3 guns on Friday. Like, wait, what? But his relationship with kids was able to make a bad situation not turn into a worse situation. And, when you realize that there's so much that are going on in the nooks and crannies of schools, like, those are the stories that need to emerge, because what we have is a lot of political, the political landscape really doesn't just lay a blanket. It almost lays a complete covering, right? Like a invisible covering over what actually is happening in schools. And that becomes, the challenge that we work through. And I started to think, like, man, are we actually dealing with more of what people's perceptions are, as opposed to really sharing and dealing with the work that really is making a difference in our school? And that's why those people, principals of the year from all over the states, were there to be able to talk about it, but also to figure out, how do we help the profession? How do we bring clarity to what this profession really is, and the value that schools, school leaders, and teachers bring?
That's powerful. So I'm just curious about the connections that you've made as a result of this experience, and how are those going to carry on past this, and how is that important for the both of you? When you think about just maintaining resilience, right, and staying optimistic and hopeful about the work that you're doing, and the times. Because I totally agree with what you're saying, Marcus. Schools are right now in the political crosshairs. We're a political football. We're being used. There's no doubt between now and November, we're going to see related to schools be a part of that. And I'm sure campaign ads, the whole thing. And so it feels like the way that we persevere through that is together and locking arms, telling our stories, and being there to encourage one another. So I'm just curious, like, what new relationships did you build and are going to carry past this experience?
Well, I will tell you that the Department of Education each state was represented by their state teacher of the year. And here in Illinois, we just had the double whammy because Andy was there and I was able to be there. So we were able to cover a lot more ground in trying to make those connections. And people know Illinois and even the Secretary of Education. I think that's one of the biggest connections we were able to make, because Andy and I were both there on Monday when we met with and kind of it was a lot of people in the room, but we sat front row, like arm's reach from the stage to be able to hear him. He made eye contact with us and really hearing what we had to say when we were able to step to the mic and talk. And then again on Wednesday, when I was able to head to the White House campus and have conversation, I said, hey, look, like Illinois will sit in this seat at some point as holding a secretary seat, but there's great work that's going on. And I even invited them to come on over to Illinois and hang out. I don't care where you land, just land in Illinois somewhere and we'll converge wherever you are to be able to welcome you. So a lot of those connections are recognized both at the federal level, but even just across all of the states with connecting with the principals, because there's valued resources that we were able to tap into. And we've created a network even through our phones where we're able to stay connected, share resources with each other and, through apps. So we're excited about that.
Awesome. So I want to get around to your White House experience, Marcus, but Andy, what were you hearing during that time where you had all these leaders from across the country convene with the secretary? Of course, he's a former school leader, former principal himself, and then went up into the State Department and then moved on into obviously the U.S. Department of Ed. What kinds of things were you hearing from him? What was the interaction like between him and the other leaders? What really stood out to you there?
Well, first of all, for the first time in my career, and I know I'd like to think I'm fairly young still, but I felt like Secretary Cardona actually listened to us and actually cared. He genuinely wanted to know what he could do to help. And so we talked about money, obviously, is it ARP?
ARP.
The ARP and ESSER funds and all that.
Yeah. So how much that helped schools and how we were able to do things that we normally weren't able to do with those funds, but how important it was to continue funding schools at a higher level. And then I think universally across this country, the big focus was social emotional health of not only our students, but of our teachers, of our parapros, our support staff, and of administrators. It's genuinely developing or maybe already in crisis mode. And every state, no matter whether rural or urban or inner city, it was genuinely, we need more healthcare professionals. We need more mental health support. And I don't think it's any different than my school. I don't know that it's any different in Marcus's or across this country. And I know you get outside of education a little bit by into that, but one thing I really appreciate about Secretary Cardona, I even talked about rural internet. He said he has no problem reaching into other departments in the country, and I forgot the names of the other ones he talked about, but the Health and Human Services and reaching over to them and saying, hey, how can we join forces to put more social workers and counselors into schools and train more teachers on the mental health, first aid, those sort of things. So I think that was the one thing that was across the board, finance and SEL.
Yeah, well, and that's pretty consistent, Marcus, when you and I were back there in February with both national associations, SSP and ESP, during the advocacy conference, and hearing from him, especially with the funding, he's like, tell your story, because what's happening with the funding right now from, the pandemic dollars that have come through will set the tone probably for the next decade's worth of federal funding for schools, because we got to make sure that, one, we spend it all, two, that we spend it the right way so that people know that we used it, for worthwhile purposes. And so there's only one way to let them know that, and then that's to share about what's happening and how things might have been without it.
And I think go ahead. I think that's key, to know is like, yeah, the money exists right now, and we're spending it and we're figuring out creative ways to spend it. And we also have to think like that's Sprint money. At some point, the money will stop. Like I won't say will stop, but this amount of allocation will be done, which is why those applications for what schools need to do and school districts need to do need to happen. And we need to spend that money. However, the money that we're spending, we also got to think of the long game, right? Of the supports that we're putting in place for kids, whether it's meeting the needs of social emotional well-being within the building for staff and students, whether it's academic supports and interventions for our young people, increasing the staff, looking at infrastructure of our buildings, things of that nature. When we think of the long game, it's also what people are going to look at is, okay, now that you've told your story, you spent this money, how do we help sustain and continue what you're doing? Because what's going to be hard is we put these things into place, we get down the road and we're like, hey kids, you've had all these academic interventions and social emotional support. Thank you, ARP and these ESSER dollars and so forth. But we got to take it back because we don't have the money to be able to sustain. So the response is that our local, state, and federal governments are going to then look at how they can continue to support what we initially bought with this money. And I think that is the important piece, is how can you create a sustainable plan and be able to share how you're using those dollars, and that's important.
Totally agree. And I know there's been some trepidation for people when it comes to spending the money because they're concerned about sustainability, but we still have to make sure that we've proven that we need these dollars and also with the funds that are there. Now, Marcus, you had an especially unique experience when you referenced going to the White House campus and being a part of a meeting with Secretary Cardona there, along with Beth Huff, who was the National Principal of the Year from the state of Missouri. She was a keynoter for our virtual conference here back in 2021. But you had another special guest that showed up as part of that meeting. So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so crazy story, right? Like we're sitting there, we're having conversation. We're about an hour and a half in with Secretary Cardona, Gene Sperling, a senior economic advisor to the president. Like he meets with the president multiple times a day or a week, and then their staff, as well as some teachers who were there. The teacher of the year, Kurt Russell, who was an awesome guy to be able to meet, and just having that conversation. And then in walked Secret Service. And I looked at Secretary Cardona, nobody batted an eye. Everybody kind of kept talking, but I see this large Secret Service agent walk in, stand next to the door. And I'm like, well, Secretary Cardona's Secret Service agent is over there. And then I saw a flutter of purple kind of lurking off in the corner. And it was just a flurry of people in the lobby, and things just seemed to scramble, and in walks good old Dr. Jill Biden, and my mouth, like nobody could see the door, and Beth was talking and my mouth was like, I couldn't believe it. And then everybody turned around and kind of changed the game. And it was awesome for her to come in, because she came in very cool, calm, and collected, and sat down and was like, okay, what are we talking about? Let's talk ARP. Let's hear from you. What's going on in your schools? And just a genuine care for the work that we do, but just humble and passionate about education, which is great to see, not at just the Department of Education, but in our highest position in our nation, for the recognition of education, educators, and the work that is happening day in and day out. So it was awesome to be able to meet her and be able to spend about, probably 15 to 20 minutes, with the First Lady. That's a big deal.
Well, it's probably a pretty comfortable place for her, because you guys are her people. I mean, educators are her people, right? I mean,
she just knew what to talk. She knew what to say, and Secretary Cardona said the same thing. I think he made a comment when we were at the Department of Education, and he sat down before he started. He was like, I know this is time I want to be able to hear from you all, as opposed to you all reaching for your hip, trying to grab your radio, which sits right on the hip. And just to hear that just gave some clarity to understanding, like, what we deal with, like the PTSD of the radio going off this year. Unreal, right?
No doubt. So let me ask you guys one final question here. Andy, I'll start with you. What would be just one key takeaway from the experience? One maybe thing you've learned, maybe something that is going to propel you forward as a school leader, as some sort of encouragement that maybe you received, just to help with resilience and purpose, right? What has been what was really impactful for you?
So I'm gonna focus on the importance of networking and finding an accountability partner. I think we already know that. Obviously Marcus and his positions, and I say multiple positions as principal at Huntley and the IPA. I'm very involved in my school, the Two Rivers region, trying to get more involved in the IPA. We have so many administrators, and I'm going to just talk about Illinois, that live in their own little bubble. And it's hard because they have so many responsibilities and so many things to do, but we have to get out of that bubble. We have great administrators all across this state and in our own regions that we aren't relying on and leaning on and using to learn from. And there's too many of us that are just doing it on an island by ourselves. And what I found is they're across this country as well. And so I've expanded, like Marcus said, we have this WhatsApp app, and I think he's actually the moderator of it, or however you word that. And so we are continually building those networks because we are by ourselves, and there's so many things that happen in a daily and yearly basis that we can't go to the teacher next door or to our secretary or whatever the case and talk about, that we need each other. And so we have so many opportunities thanks to the IPA. Jason, I think you do a fantastic job of these Wednesdays. I know tomorrow morning, shameless plug, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. IPA region, but why not? Take an hour a week, take 2 hours a week, and reach out to our regions and have those meetings and have IPA meetings and build a network, because that's what we do. We want to do what's best for our schools, for our teachers, for our kids, and we can't do it by ourselves. So I think that's what I just reiterated it more by going to this NASSP. And I'm pumped still. I'm still on a high, and I know at some point in time I'm going to crash. But I am just on a high about everything that I learned, people that I got to meet. One thing I didn't touch on is the NHS, and I'm still not sure if it's a gala or a gala. It's the first one I've ever went to. But either way,
NHS being National Honor Society, by the way, right? National Honor Society.
National Honor Society. So the top 25 NHS students in the country, from over 10,000 applicants, they whittled it down to 25, and these kids, I mean, wow. I mean, so these kids are starting their own non-for-profits, raising, hundreds of thousands of dollars for the non-for-profits. I went home and I looked at my daughter, who's going to be a senior, and I said, you better pick up your game, young lady, and she's a really good girl. I'm a proud dad, but holy cow. I mean, I could talk for 20 minutes about those kids. So back to your original question, Jason, there's so many great things and people around us. We've got to start using more of that to do better for our schools and for our kids.
Yeah. Well, I'll just, to punctuate that point, is this is me wrapping up year 16 in this seat. And I've had plenty of opportunities to see people thrive and flame out. And in a lot of cases, it's because of, their willingness to get engaged with their colleagues and stay close, to be there to hold each other up, especially when things are a bit rocky. And of course, we've needed that now, and we're going to continue to need it as we work through kind of where we are, completely moving into the endemic phase of the pandemic in particular.
So it was a quote that somebody had mentioned while we were there, and it was, thinking about a candle, right? And you can't blow out a flame that hasn't been lit. And when I thought about that, like, I wrote it down on several places, and I'm like, how big is my fire? How big is my flame? And while this week of events and being with people and hearing their stories is kind of rejuvenated me and given me a level of, like, this is why I'm doing this. I want to be able to take my flame and continue to light other people. And a lot of that is through hearing their story, through connecting and networking. But I think the biggest piece of that is advocacy for the work that we are doing every single day. Things can get done to us in education. We know when legislation comes, it just rolls to us, and we had no say, no seat at the table. And so I am a big proponent of, if the table is full and you're not at it, well, you better move people out and create yourself a seat, stand next to it, or stand on top of it, so that you can be heard. But we have
so you're not the main course. You may not be a seat at the table, you be on the table.
Exactly. But I want to be on the table. I want to be loud. I want to let people know, like, man, this is really what is happening. And this is the effects in which the people who can make the decisions, who don't sit in the seat, who don't have the experience of knowing what it's like for me to run a building of 3,000 or for even a school of 100, 200. It's important to know. It's important to hear that story. The other piece that I will say is connecting with both your local and your state organization as well as your national organization. You know, what I'm so excited about is the 6,000 plus members that we have in IPA, and we fluctuate here and there at the top. And while we have a lot of people who pay the dues and want to be a part and get the emails and take the academies and so forth, there is so much more that can be done by actively being engaged, by actively spreading the word that of the stuff that we have going. It can't be those that just decide, hey, I want to show up. We could easily say we don't have enough time in our schedule, but if you can intentionally make time for the things that matter the most, and if our profession is what matters and our kids are what matters in schools, which are a pinnacle part of every community, if that's what matters, then we need voices at the table. We need people to stand up and say, yep, I'm there. I'm going to advocate for this and let's make it happen. So.
Right there at that. Gentlemen, sure appreciate your time and willingness to share your reflections from last week. Just energizes me listening to you talk a little bit and hear the story about what took place. So Andy Stumpf there in Winchester, not far from my home, there in West Central Illinois, and Marcus Beelan up in Huntley. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Pleasure. You bet. Again, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. As always, thanks for joining me for this IPA talk. If there's anything IPA can do for you, reach out to us at any time at www.ilprincipals.org or give us a call because we're only a phone call away. Take care.